In our video covering the history of European space governance, we mentioned there's not one but two so-called Europes in space, the EU and the European Space Agency. In the second module of this MOOC, we described the basic division of tasks between these two organizations, but we noted that there are still some tensions that are remaining. So only with a clear legal framework to guide the cooperation between EU and ESA can this situation really be addressed. So does this framework exist, and if so, what does it look like? We saw the Lisbon Treaty ask the EU to establish any appropriate relations with ESA. Whatever form these relations would take, they had to build on the foundations of cooperation that already existed at the time the Lisbon Treaty entered into force in 2009. At the time, the relationship between EU and ESA was based on the 2004 framework agreement between ESA and what was then the European Community. This framework agreement was originally intended as a provisional mechanism for 4 years, but it remained in force for much longer than that. The framework agreement governed the day-to-day relations between the EU and ESA as they cooperated on the flagship programs of Galileo and Copernicus. Now, to guide this cooperation, the agreement established a joint secretariat and the so-called Space Council. The Space Council is not really a standing body, it's essentially a series of joint meetings of the EU Competitiveness Council and the ESA Council at ministerial level. In May 2007, the Space Council adopted the first ever European space policy, which provided a common political framework for space activities in Europe. However, in the years since, the EU has increasingly set its own course on the relationship with ESA, and the meetings of the Space Council have grown increasingly rare. In a 2012 communication, the European Commission clarified what it thought the phrase "any appropriate relations" in the Lisbon Treaty actually meant. Specifically, the Commission identified 5 structural shortcomings in the relationship between the EU and ESA at the time. First of all, a mismatch of funding rules. ESA procurement is based on a geographical return to the investing countries, but the EU does not actually allow for distinction based on such nationality. Secondly, there's also clearly an asymmetry in membership between the two organizations. The EU's membership has evolved since 1957, and it currently brings together 27 states from all over Europe, but it does not include some major players in space, such as the UK, and it also does not include countries like, for example, Norway or Switzerland. The UK, Norway, and Switzerland are, however, member states of ESA, but some countries that are members of the EU are not member states of ESA, or they are only associate or cooperating members of ESA, like Croatia or Latvia. Canada is also a cooperating member of ESA, but obviously it's not a member of the European Union. There's also, thirdly, an asymmetry in defense mandate between ESA and the EU. ESA is only mandated to pursue and strengthen European cooperation in space for peaceful purposes, but the EU was already, in 2012, starting to become an increasingly ambitious defense and security player. Fourthly, even though we had the interim arrangements of the 2004 Framework Agreement, there really were no structural mechanisms for policy coordination between the EU and ESA at the time. And finally, the EU found that ESA lacked the democratic legitimacy that, for example, the European Parliament did give to the EU. All of these differences remain true to this day in one way or another. Now, to resolve this situation, the Commission identified 3 possible long-term outcomes to improve the relationship between the EU and ESA. These possible outcomes are, first of all, simply enhancing the existing cooperation between the two Europes in space under the status quo. Second option is to bring ESA as an intergovernmental organization under the authority of the European Union. Third possible outcome was to transform ESA into an EU agency, which would essentially mean dissolving ESA as a separate organization. Now, each solution had its own benefits and drawbacks, but the Commission was very clear that, in their view, there should be a rapprochement of ESA towards the EU rather than the other way around. As we know, ESA and EU to this day are still 2 independent international organizations, and the first option of enhanced cooperation under the status quo ultimately appeared to be the most realistic choice. Now, the legal context of this status quo has, of course, shifted over the years, and the foundations of the 2004 Framework Agreement have been complemented and later substituted by new instruments. The fundamental cornerstone of the EU-ESA relationship remains the understanding that the two organizations share common objectives. These include securing Europe's access to space, which is currently being pursued through Ariane 6, and implementing space programs that support the EU's policy goals. The different institutional setups, operational frameworks, and expertise of the two organizations means that both should be given their own tasks and their own responsibilities in pursuing these objectives. We know from the previous module that the EU retains the overall responsibility for the EU space program, while ESA is entrusted with specific tasks to implement various components of this program. In so doing, ESA should act in accordance with the rules of the EU, but in turn the EU can participate in optional programs of ESA in accordance with the rules of the agency. Finally, both organizations have a duty of information and consultation in order to coordinate their activities as much as possible. The Space Council is one way to do so, but the organizations can also, for example, exchange personnel between each other. In recent years, the relationship between the EU and ESA has found a new dynamic, although not without its own challenges. In October 2016, ESA and the EU signed a declaration on a joint European space policy. But this really did not go much further than simply repeating that EU and ESA share the same objectives in space and that they wish to strengthen their cooperation in line with Article 189 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU and the ESA Convention. In November 2020, the 10th EU-ESA Space Council essentially repeated this same ambition. It stressed the importance of coordinated actions by the EU, ESA, and their member states, but it did not really clarify how this should be done. It just reiterated that the various actors in EU space governance have parallel competences and different tasks and responsibilities, and that any coordination between them should fully respect the institutional settings and the operational frameworks of the two organizations. These political declarations did not really appear to change a lot, but their general words were put into practice by some agreements between ESA and specific EU bodies dealing with specific space initiatives. For example, based on an agreement with the Commission in 2019, ESA will provide the space satellites component of a new encrypted European quantum communication infrastructure. And in February 2021, ESA and the European Defence Agency concluded an agreement providing for expanded cooperation in the development of secure satellite communications. So when it finally arrived, the 2021 regulation establishing the Union Space Programme confirmed this general division of tasks and responsibilities between EU and ESA. Now, because it was an EU document, it could not reframe the relationship between the EU and ESA by itself, but it did task the European Commission with negotiating a new financial framework partnership agreement with ESA. This agreement would further define the roles, responsibilities, and obligations of the Commission, the EUSPA, and ESA for each component of the EU space program. After months of negotiations, the FFPA, as it's known, was signed in June 2021. It represents an EU investment of almost 9 billion euros in the period of 2021 to 27. In turn, it requires ESA to apply the security rules of the EU in processing classified information, that it applies the EU procurement rules when it procures in the name and on behalf of the Union, and it adds the Commission to the Tender Evaluation Board for any procurement based on the FFPA. This agreement is complemented by a series of contribution agreements between the Commission, EUSPA, and ESA that further detail their respective roles and their responsibilities. Taking all of this into account, it's safe to say the relationship between the EU and ESA is a rather complex affair. It requires a good understanding of the history of EU space governance and its institutional framework. So if you feel a bit lost, don't hesitate to review the videos of the first two modules to refresh your memory.